Welcome to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamwork's Intelligence. In every episode, we bring you insights into the teams behind the teams in professional football. Coming up on today's episode.
Sleep matters just as much in football today as it did 20 years back. But as we proceed into the future with football, it's going to matter even more, right? Because we will play more and more games and we will have less and less time to actually recover in between the games.
I'm Simon Austin from Training Ground Guru, and our guest on this episode is Anna West. Anna is a world-renowned sleep expert who works with teams competing in the Premier League, Champions League, and the current World Cup. Her methods have helped to change the way that football thinks about sleep and recovery. In this episode, Anna told me how she came to work in football, about the work she does with clubs and players, and she also debunked some common myths about sleep. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, please give us a follow via your preferred podcast provider. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, Anna.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for inviting me.
How did you get involved in your line of work? Because it's quite unusual.
It's a good question, and you're definitely not the first one to ask, like, how do you end up in sleep and recovery? So I was studying sports science at the Copenhagen University, and then later on proceeded into medical nursing. And then straight out of university, I considered lucky, to be honest, hired into a medical technical company that was specialized in sleep and recovery. But already, like during my studies, I was utterly fascinated by the concept of sleep and how little we actually put emphasis on it as a part of performance enhancement. And this is years back in time. And also on a personal level, probably really neglected it because I could survive without it, I thought. But I literally couldn't. And I had a quite forward-thinking professor at the university as well, I think, who realized that that was probably one area where I didn't nail it. And he one day brought me I wouldn't call it like the Bible of sleep, but really asked me to like look into this topic. And then I got utterly fascinated by it. Got into a role in this medical technical company that was specialized in sleep, but didn't really have the bridge into performance. And then was lucky to be tasked with building up projects in sports. And then later on proceeding into founding my own consultancy, mainly because I was incredibly fascinated by all the research we do in sleep, but quite annoyed about never doing the real translation into strategies that could actually be applied in the environments as well.
Were you working with sports people straight away, or did that come later?
Yeah, no, more or less straight away, because from my former company, we built up research projects in various constellations with federations, also with clubs to a smaller degree. We worked a lot with technology, etc. But I think I was quite lucky because I was able to work with different sports and not with this like one-dimensional view into one sport. And that's quite a big advantage as well.
We associate you with football now, and I think before I spoke to you, might be getting on 10 years ago now, and we did a very popular article.
Yeah.
So, what point did you get involved with football?
That's around 10 years back where it became like heavily oriented into football, if I'm completely honest. I've always had a quite firm interest in football, to be honest, as well. And I would say sleep matters just as much in football today as it did 10 years back or even 20 years back. But as we proceed into the future with football, it's going to matter even more, right? Because we will play more and more games and we will have less and less time to actually recover in between the games. And we will have, let's say, I wouldn't call it like advanced congested scheduling, but we really need to have like some very smart structures around football. The body wasn't like really like built to sleep the way that football allows us to do. So we need to think quite smart when we are then creating sleep structures in a sport like football.
Did you find it easy to be accepted in football? Because there can be a thing sometimes as a woman, but also you're in quite a new discipline that they might not have heard that much about before.
I would actually say yes, but I was also then, I kind of like wandered my baby steps in an environment that really wanted to put an emphasis on this. The thing is that I would argue that any environment, even like 10 years back and especially today, like every environment works with sleep at some degree, to be honest. I think a lot of environment think that they work with sleep as well because they do, a workshop or they educate a little bit around it and then they leave it up to the players. I was lucky to get into an environment that basically saw it as a very needed basic to evolve other areas of performance as well. And for that matter, it quickly became a part of the performance enhancement and not an isolated thing that the player had to do.
And I suppose this might have been part of your argument to start with, but how important is sleep, especially for athletes? Why do they need to sleep well?
The easy argument is that we can't enhance performance over time if we don't sleep well, because the most important recovery modality, the most legal one that we have available, is actually sleep, because this is where we produce all the hormones that supports the muscles to rebuild themselves. So injury mitigation is a part of sleep, or vice versa, right? When we sleep better, we also prevent injuries. This is where we heal. This is where we produce the hormones. This is also where we have a lot of our emotional stability created. This is where we move learning from short-term memory to long-term memory. So basically everything that we do during the day is kind of like consolidated during sleep and allows us to advance the day after. And that's the simple way to put it. So sleep doesn't really need a lot of arguments. Once people start to understand what sleep actually does to the body. The thing is that people, I think, might be a little bit stuck in like previous perception of sleep is we go into dead and we go half dead, then we wake up and then we do something else. Whereas if you look at like brain activity as an example, we are like incredibly active in the brain during the day, but we're just as active during the night. It's just a very different type of activity. So what we do during the night is almost like a precondition for what happens during the day.
We've done a lot on the website about cognition and decision making and how important that is for footballers. So your decision making would be impaired if you were not to sleep well for a period of time.
And if you translate that into football, right, it's reaction times, it's decision making on the pitch. It's even how fast you are in the pitch, and that can come from different types of elements. But let's say you're on the pitch and you're sleep deprived, your reaction time is slower, and that can mean the difference between winning and losing. So there is definitely an element of sleep being a needed basic for us to advance our performance, but it also comes with a funny challenge because we have late kickoff times, we travel, we have congested schedule, we play more and more games. So what we need to be able to perform better is often compromised more and more by the structures that we have.
There's research as well, is there, that your injury risk will increase also if you're having poor sleep as well for a period of time?
Yeah, there's definitely evidence that points towards it, but I think it's incredibly important that when someone like me enters into an environment, that sleep doesn't become associated with the risk of an injury. So that if I can't sleep well, then I'm getting injured tomorrow. And there's a lot of different ways of communicating sleep. I just literally, before I went on this podcast, I saw that one club had done a video on Instagram on the importance of sleep. And then they're talking about the importance of players sleeping 8 to 10 hours every night. Otherwise, there's a higher risk of an injury. And higher numbers of hours does not equal better sleep, right? You can sleep 10 hours and it's crappy hours, and it doesn't mean quality. So in a system where we quite often know that the hours will be compromised because of the system, it's much more important that we preach sleep quality into the hours that we can get. A good example would be, let's say you have a late kickoff time. Every day, like everything we do in the stadium is compromising sleep, right? We have adrenaline, light exposure, we win, we lose. There are a lot of emotions at play. Some players might take caffeine before they go on pitch. They have energy drinks. So everything we do at the point of time in the day where the body should actually like slow down, we beam it up. So we should almost expect that we can't sleep. So it's absolutely fine after a late night match if the hours and the quality is compromised. The trigger point is actually getting them to sleep well on match day +1. And if I was in an environment preaching the fact that they all need 8 to 10 hours sleep per night, otherwise there's a high risk of an injury, I'm also not really selling the concept in the right way. It's about getting them to sleep well in the windows that they have available. And that's quite important, if I'm honest.
It seems to be that people have become much more aware about sleep and the importance of sleep, and they're monitoring it a lot more with wearables.
Yeah.
But is there a case that that's also increased anxiety about sleep? People are thinking, worrying about it more.
Definitely, and it's a quite important topic to touch upon as well in football, because look, everyone today, especially like high level football, most players today, they will have tried to measure like sleep at some level or to some degree. I usually say that technology can be a support, but in itself, it's not a solution, right? Because you really need to understand the data in a context, and you can compare it very much to nutrition. We want them to have the right nutrition, but we don't want it to turn into a disorder where it's an eating disorder that's actually working against them. So it needs to be built on, how can you say, smart behavior, smart translation, but even more also with care, right? Because also there's a high discussion point about the accuracy of the data as well. The Whoop or the O-ring that sits on your hand doesn't necessarily know that you're a Premier League football player that also has to play Champions League. So it's very important that if we are using technology, and I'm not saying technology is bad, I'm just saying in itself it's not a solution. It needs to be brought into systems where the translation of the data is done in a thoughtful but also in a caring way. We can all survive like a red set of data.
Yeah.
So it's not so much the red data, it's also sometimes figuring out where does the red data stem from, right? So there's a lot of technology and there's definitely a massive hype around it. But it's also important that people approach it a little bit with a critical mindset.
Do you think that the night games are particularly difficult then? So if you're in Europe and you've got Champions League and you're playing 8 o'clock, and so your heart rate will be high, your adrenaline will probably be high, does that then make it impossible to sleep?
The challenge is the shift, if I'm honest, that we have shifting kickoff times and not purely the fact that we have late kickoff times. If we did the same every night, we would start to create a rhythm that would be adjusted to that. But then you have 12 o'clock, noon kickoff time. Then you have an afternoon kickoff time, and then you have an evening kickoff time. And if you kind of like scrape it down to like a rule, like basic biology, human being, we were born to wake up when the sun came up, when the temperatures outside would come up, when the daylight came. And when the light disappeared, the sun went down and the temperature outside went down. That's when we would go to bed again, right? And when we have like kickoff times at different times, we don't really like favor the biology that we came with. So we are creating systems around an existing biology. And when we do that, we also sometimes need to accept that it is more difficult for the body to figure out what to do when. But if we did the same at the same time every day, it wouldn't be so difficult.
People always talk about this magic 8 hours, don't they, as well?
Yeah.
But is that realistic? Or would you find that if we went back, say, before like electric light, did people sleep more when it was dark, as you say? So in the summer, they would sleep for a short amount of time, winter for a long?
The thing is, if we go 100 years back in time, like we do have research, but we have, subjective data. This was what people reported back. There's for sure an element of the research believing that we were sleeping more solid because we had more like consistency in our habits around how we lived. We were not switched on consistently all the time, as an example as well. So it's not just the electric light, it's also our habits around things that have developed. A phone, as an example, sitting here with a phone, like a phone in itself is not bad, but it's usually the habits around how we navigate with that phone, that can be either like very productive for us or bad for us, if I'm honest. That's also why, so when, as an example, if I work with a club, and I go in and I need to make an evaluation of, let's say, the sleep status in a club, it's not just looking at how the players sleep, but it's also like the whole system around how we set them up to a good night's sleep. And I think, going back to your question, that has probably changed a lot. Because in the past, it would, let's say you were a football player, Simon, it would be completely your responsibility. You left the training ground, and then it was kind of expected that you figured that one out yourself and came back and rested the next morning. I think what has changed, at least over my time in football, is that we are realizing and taking more responsibility in regards to how we set the players up to a better night's sleep. Look, a good night's sleep does not start with sleep hygiene before we go to bed at night. It starts in the morning, and everything that we add, and I've said this quite a lot, also been quoted for saying it quite a lot. Look, a good night's sleep starts in the morning, and everything that we add into that day equation results in something sleep. Because we also have to remember, in football, we have trained young, healthy adults. Like, we don't have a lot of players with like actual sleeping disorders, but we have a lot of poor sleep, which is induced by habits that does not link into biology. And that's also why over the past couple of years, what we have done with the systems that we are working with is we would never go in and just like look at the player's sleep isolated. We basically go in and make an analysis of the environment to figure out where are the opportunities, where do we compromise, and it can stem from a lot of different angles. Travel management, like how do we even decide to travel? When do we decide to travel? Does it fit the kickoff time the next day? If we preach, let's say, napping time in a club, do we even offer them a place to do the nap? It equals a little bit, you don't see a club today that would preach nutrition without serving the right food in the canteen as well. And I think that has definitely advanced in my time in football.
So I was going to ask you that, actually. So you've worked with clubs in the Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, I think, Champions League, International.
Yeah.
So what do you do when you first work with a club? Could you take us through those steps?
When we start, like when we go into a club, the first step that we would do is to do like a full-blown analysis of all the players, but actually also the staff surrounding the players. And then based on the data that we collect, we start to do some educational sessions as well. But what we have also developed over the last year is what we call a club recovery scorecard, where we look at 11 different areas in a club that all link into how we create the sleep opportunity that I described before. A good example would be, we would look at travel structures of a club. Let's say you have a club, and basically today when they travel, it's not just going on a bus going from A to B, right? Depending on the kickoff time, they will travel at different times. Then it's important for us to figure out, okay, so let's say you do travel at whatever, 3:00 in the afternoon after a training session. What happens during these 3 hours also determines how you set them up to sleep on a match day -1. Because if you have players that board a bus and they have to drive for 3 hours and they're just like completely sleeping throughout that period of time, what happens is, like, involuntarily, we are actually setting them back. Like, we are not actually helping them fall asleep match day -1, because they're like removing too much sleep pressure in their system. So when you're creating a good system, you say, hey, we can't negotiate it. We have to drive at 3:00, but maybe it's a really smart idea that we put in a service stop at 4:30. So we get all of them out of the bus so that we can kind of like break the sleep pattern and that we can keep them awake until arrival, because that way we actually set them up for a good night's sleep in the hotel. These are like just an example of very small, like potentially no-brain like structures that we look at, but everything surrounding the player, which also stems from structures in the club, will then ultimately lead into sleep opportunities. So we work basically very multidisciplinary in the club. And then usually when we start in a club, what we also do, we work like selected definitely met with players on an individual basis.
So when you said you do that initial analysis, how do you do that? And would you do that with all the squad then and all the staff?
The whole squad. We do it always with the whole squad. We also do it always and suggest always to do it on staff when we come in, because look, they're performing always at the same level and sometimes even more, because the staff would have an even more extreme structure at times, right? When the players go to bed, usually staff still have to finish off as well. And it's very important that there's an aligned structure between at least staff and players for us to create an understanding of the constellation of the team. What we ultimately do is basically, when we have the data, and we've created a screening tool which is merged by 15 validated questionnaires, which were both like created for the normal population, but also for the athletic population. Then we divide them into groups. And the classic idea from a club would be that we should work with all the players that have challenges. And I usually then try to challenge it a little bit and say, look, it's not just about using sleep as something that we should fix. It's also using sleep as performance enhancement, which means that, let's say, Simon, you're a football player, but you actually sleep quite good. Can we still like change small bits and pieces around you so that you start to optimize the good foundation that you already have?
Would you use wearables at all at that stage on the players?
Yes, but not forced.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a big fan of wearable technology being something that you can select if you wish to try it. I'm also a big fan of the player knowing what is the journey of their data, like who actually sees the data. This is 24-hour data. I'm also a very big fan of having enough data so that rather than looking at the data on a day-to-day basis, we look at how the trend development of the data is rather than looking at the one day.
Because I don't know if clubs still do this now, but they used to do the wellness questionnaires, didn't they? And sleep would be one of the categories. But I think often players said they weren't honest, really, because they didn't want to be pulled out of the team or not train.
I've seen everything, to be honest. I'm not against the wellness questionnaires because they are a little gateway into getting some level of feedback. But where you need to be very mindful is what questions do you actually ask about sleep? Because you raised it before. You said, oh, there's something about these 8 hours. Like, go into any squad and ask them, like, how many hours do you think we should sleep? Then they would like raise the hand and be like, 8 hours. We know 8 hours, because everybody knows. But the much better question to ask is, so how was your energy this morning, right? Because if they woke up completely knackered, it tells me quite a lot about the quality of the sleep that they have. And there are like a lot of qualitative questions that you can actually ask that are a lot smarter than how many hours of sleep did you get last night, that will then link into a lot more information about what that sleep actually was. So if you do smart wellness questionnaires, you get like productive answers. But if you do like very unsmart questionnaires, you can't really use the data other than seeing if there's something that changes in a trend.
Yeah.
If a player is always replying 8 hours as an example, and he all of a sudden starts to report 6, there's something you need to dig into, but you still don't have, let's say, enough evidence to figure out what is actually going on.
And is it important that the questions are asked kind of without judgment as well? Because players can be worried the repercussions of what they say.
That's a quite important topic when we speak about sleep. Sleep needs to be implemented with a lot of care and a lot of understanding towards sometimes why they can't sleep, which can be something which is linked to football. It can be something which is linked to something very private, etc. So rather than just judging on why they can't sleep or if they're not sleeping enough, it needs to be done with care so you can like get to the root cause of why. And look, at the end of the day, football players are human beings, right? That there are a lot of different like causes to why we can't sleep. Stress, small kids, like worry, stupid habits, you name it. There are a lot of different things. And that's also why when we work with sleep, the thing is actually, I'm not a big fan of the word sleep, right? Because sleep is a result. And 9 out of 10 times, even if I asked you and you said, oh, Jesus, I'm tired, then you would go like, oh, it's probably because I need more sleep. But maybe it's because you need something else that can foster better sleep. And So when we work with players in the environment, we usually work around like 7 different types of rest that all links in to sleep somehow. It can be, hey, I'm exhausted because I miss social context, but not necessarily in the club, but with family. And it drains me that I'm with the club all the time so change of context can sometimes give you energy, which is not just because you're tired, like physically tired, but because you need to have something completely different. And when you map out with players where it's sometimes that this tiredness stems from, it's not always just a lack of sleep. It can be a lack of a lot of different things. And that's quite important when you talk about sleep, because again, there can be a million reasons to why we are not sleeping well or why we find it difficult to fall asleep.
You said earlier that good sleep starts in the morning.
Yeah.
Did you mean that in terms of getting daylight early on for the circadian rhythm that you were talking about?
How we build biology or how we set biology up in the smartest way from we wake up determines how we can then ultimately fall asleep. And it is important to get morning light. It is important to remember that we were not born with a fridge and a water tap and so forth. We were born to actually move in the morning. We also have to remember that when we've been sleeping, we wake up quite dehydrated. So if we don't foster habits where players actually learn to hydrate straight from the morning when they wake up, we can then lead them into a situation where they're slightly dehydrated when they have to go to bed. And if they're dehydrated when they have to go to bed, it knocks into how your hormones are working, because you then produce less melatonin, which is your sleep hormone. So all these small habits that in conjunction can create that connection to better sleep sets you up. And that's why a good night's sleep starts in the morning.
Yeah. And there are so many kind of myths about or tips that come out there about sleep from so many people. So a big one, you talked about the dehydration, has been about the mouth taping and how you should breathe through your nose when you're asleep. What do you think about that?
I'm utterly against let's call it initiatives or interventions where there's like no real evidence behind it, or where we actually know that it can have a negative effect on you. There will definitely be a level of placebo, and I have definitely had my share of players who have heard about it or trialed it because they heard someone else. The thing is, if you have an underlying condition, as an example, sleep apnea, taping your mouth is not very smart. And I'm yet to see like real data that proves that taping your mouth is a really good idea during the night. There are some evidence that points towards like nasal breathing during exercise can be quite productive for the outcome of your training session because of the exchange of oxygen. What I see and what I've tested and data that I can't publish, but I have enough data to draw my own internal conclusions, is that we actually see people having a lot more like involuntary movement when they're mouth taping. And when they're mouth taping, the reason why they start to move is because they gasp for air, and that feels uncomfortable. They start to toss and turn, and what they then do in return is they break their own sleep cycle. So the quality that they want to optimize actually gets compromised.
Teamwork's intelligence gives clubs an edge that can enable smarter decisions faster. When most teams are drowning in data and not getting nearly enough out of it, Teamwork's intelligence can clear the way. Built by a powerhouse team of sports data scientists, engineers, and football data experts who have been shaping this industry for over a decade, we understand the challenges teams face. With data now at the forefront of scouting, recruitment, and team analysis, Teamwork's intelligence has built a platform that turns billions of data points into precise models, predictive metrics, and insights that actually make a difference to a club's performance, both on and off the field. Ready to level up? Head to teamworks.com to learn more.
Yeah, I think something I see in football in all different areas is like results bias, I would say. Yeah. So I think, was it Haaland who said he taped his mouth? So obviously he's a great player. So people think, oh, that must be a good thing to do because he's a great player.
But that's like with every intervention, to be honest, right? We as a as a predominant figure in a sport, whatever you do, you hold a quite big responsibility when you start to preach any type of intervention, whether it has or has not evidence behind it. But yes, he went on a podcast and basically said something in the line of, hey, if anybody wants to reach my level in football, they should mouth tape. And my email exploded, to be honest. And WhatsApp was like, should I mouth tape as well? And I go, absolutely not. I think it's very important also that, look, there are a lot of sexy quick fixes around sleep, right? There are a lot of mattress companies that will claim that if you sleep on my mattress, you're definitely going to sleep better, et cetera, et cetera. And I usually say, look, you can sleep on the most advanced mattress, but if you don't know how to shut down your brain and actually fall asleep, you don't really get the return on your investment. And you can also buy a really expensive mattress, but if you're a football player who needs to sleep 200 days in different hotels, maybe it's very important that we don't rely on a specific mattress, but we have, a backpack of tools that we can travel around with, thereby not saying that a mattress is not good, because a mattress is a quite important key to a good night's sleep. And you wouldn't believe how many shitty mattress solutions I've seen as well out there. But I think it's just important. And this is where sleep needs to be put into a context. You and I, we probably sleep more days at home than a Premier League, Champions League football player, right? So the interventions that we can apply around us might be slightly different than the ones that have to sleep 200 days on the road. And hence why it's also going back to the club recovery scorecard. No club is the same. And that's also why it's quite important to go in, look specifically at the structures that are in that specific club to see what do they actually do? What do they travel with? Small things do they very low key, do they even encourage the players to travel with their own pillow? Imagine you go 200 days into different hotels with different pillows, and one pillow is high, the other one is low, and it pulls your neck. A good idea, potentially simple solution, get the players to travel with their own pillows. The intervention starts by figuring out what pillow do they favor, what do they like, how can we get them to bring stuff along, which is super easy, a little bit of a no-brainer. I usually call it a toothbrush, right? So nobody really wants to travel without a toothbrush because it's not very nice. And if we forgot it, we go to the reception and we get an extra one, right? Having these small toothbrushes that we can bring along are quite smart, because there's also some going back to cognition, some pattern recognition, that when we bring things with us that we can relate to, it makes it a little bit easier for the brain to fall asleep in these destinations that we are going to, or at these destinations that we are going to.
So when you talked about doing the initial analysis with the club, would you then look at trends across the squad then, and initial things that could help everyone? Is that how it would work?
Definitely. We definitely look at the trends across the squad, and it can be quite different. There are also a lot of cultural aspects that needs to be taken into consideration. If you head down south in Europe, they will have late meal times because it's a part of the culture. It's a big part of the culture that siesta has been a way that you grew up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important that you look at these individualities when you're then creating, let's call it the overall new interventions as well. But then what we also do is that we together with the club performance medical staff, we would pick out profiles that would benefit from working with us one-on-one. And it can be the ones that sleep really poorly, but it can also be the ones that actually sleep quite well, where we can still nudge them in a direction.
You said that you would only work individually with a player if they wanted to, then the club wouldn't force them to work with you, for example.
No, look, so the philosophy for me would always be that it's something that they can select. And very, very rarely, to be honest, do I meet someone once we've been sitting down and they understand what it can give them who would say no. But with everything, with any intervention, it's always smarter when it's something that is being chosen. So when we come to the club and we've done the analysis, all the players, they also get the opportunity to get feedback as well on their screening.
Interesting. Yeah, fascinating. Because I remember we did the piece with Emi Marcondes, didn't we, a few years ago about the work you'd done with him. And yeah, he was having difficulty sleeping, wasn't he, when he first went to Brentford, I think?
He's a good example, and the story is still out there, I assume, somewhere.
Yes, yeah.
And the reason why I highlight it is because what worked on him was going back to when I talked before about these 7 types of rest that can actually lead into you sleeping better. I remember you writing about him and the fact that he started drawing as a big part of his sleep intervention, because he realized that this brought his nervous system down so that eventually he would feel calm enough to fall asleep. And thereby, I'm not saying that every football player from now on should start drawing. I've seen a lot of different ways to create that sensory stimulus in the right way, but what works for you might not work for me. And that's also why it needs to be sometimes almost like a buffet of options, if that makes sense. And this is a little bit like if you compare it to nutrition, if you want a football player to change his nutritional habits, it's also very important to figure out what type of food does he actually like. How can you get him to eat more protein, but still respecting what he likes to eat? Today, you would never see a nutritionist in any club that doesn't really take into consideration, like the taste, as an example, and the culture, like where do they come from? Because it matters. And with sleep, which is, by the way, like really linked into nutrition, and it needs to be applied with that degree of care. So you really understand not only how do they sleep today, but is there anything in their sleep history which is also contributing to the fact that they can't sleep today? If you, as a kid, grew up with, let's say, an inability to fall asleep because there was a lot of fear in your home, that can still be stuck in your system to this day, right? So if we see someone who's unable to fall asleep, sometimes the root cause can be somewhere completely else, but it needs to be done respectfully and not with a lot of judgment, because it should just be easy to sleep because you now have a very expensive mattress, as an example.
And it was interesting saying that you're very much part of the multidisciplinary team and you link in with the different areas. So would you work with a psychologist then, for example, if there was an issue like you just talked about?
Definitely. I think it's important also to say, look, sleep is not a standalone product, right? As I said, sleep is a result of many different things. So yes, definitely. And I've worked with some brilliant like sports psychologists and also like clinical psychologists in sport. And it's very important that we all understand that we play a role in sleep. And that's also why it's never like a one man's job to get someone to sleep. It's a multidisciplinary job.
Would you say there are some like universal truths with sleep? Something like having a dark room and good curtains. Would that be help anyone to sleep better?
Yeah, definitely. Like you touched upon some of the myths. Like some of the myths are true, right? With the body sleeps better when it's a cooler room, as an example. But I just had this discussion actually on a very scientific level when we are recommending players a certain temperature in a room. Let's say you grew up in South America and your average temperature was always 25 degrees. If I then stand by science and I say, oh, it needs to be between like 17 to 19 degrees, that's the optimal temperature for sleep, that person will feel that I'm recommending him to sleep in a freezer, right? So it's also a little bit like being able to adjust what we know works on the majority and then know that there will be some outliers. But yes, the body wants to sleep in a cool environment. End of story. That's it. It's much easier because when we have to fall asleep, the body needs to get rid of heat so that the core temperature can drop down. There is definitely an element of truth to the fact that we fall asleep easier when it's dark. So if you don't have like blackout curtains, bring a night mask as an example. If you sleep in a room where it's difficult to, let's say, get the temperature down, there are like air the room, take a warm shower before you go to bed. And I think the classic question that I always ask people is like, how much do you invest in your nightwear? And disclaimer, not because I'm attached to any company, but it's interesting how much money we use on optimizing our performance wear, but we use very few resources on optimizing our sleepwear. And a lot of people sweat a lot during the night without realizing it. They're just quite knackered when they wake up. And because they've been tossing and turning, because the body finds it difficult to regulate the temperature during the night. And there are some really good products on the market that can help you kind of like regulate that temperature during the night as well. And as I'm working in a marginal sport here where we want to avoid like unnecessary awakenings, actually sleeping in nightwear that can regulate the temperature can be a pretty big deal breaker for quite a lot of players as well.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, what sort of products are they then? Because I'm interested in that myself.
Well, there are different like types on the market. I've tested
like pajamas, is it?
Yeah, so pajamas. So there are different textiles used to create this function in the nightwear.
Oh, right, okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Right, interesting. I didn't know about that.
I can send you a link after the podcast.
Oh, okay, right. Thank you. And I remember there's so many people that talk about sleep, but the guy who's trying to extend his life, are these something like Brian Wilson? Or,
Brian Johnson? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
He was saying one of his number one tips is not to eat or drink within, I think, like 3 hours of going to sleep, because your body temperature will rise again.
Yeah, so when you can compare it to a quite simple picture. If you want to turn off a fire, you don't put fuel on it, right? Because then it blows up. And your metabolism is the same, right? If we eat something, we need to burn something in the system, which means your metabolism starts to work. And when the metabolism starts to work, the core temperature rises up, which means elevated blood pressure, elevated pulse. And when we have to go to sleep, the very opposite thing should actually happen. So he's right. But then if your coach then decides to have an evening training and meal is, delayed into later in the evening, basically the training comes before the eating, if that makes sense. The good question is, okay, if that is then the case, what do you then do? I would claim that most people would sleep better if they don't eat close to bedtime. I would also claim that most people would sleep better if they don't have like heavy, spicy food before they go to bed. But I would also say that and this is why it becomes multidisciplinary, it's quite important also that we load calories in the right way into players. As an example, match day minus run, right? So sometimes in sport, when we talk about sleep, it's the hen and the egg, because we have one thing we want to do over here and one thing we want to do over here. And then we need to merge it so that we land somewhere in the middle where we still load calories, but we can still sleep. So if we have to eat later, what we then have to do is be mindful about what we eat.
I've heard some people say as well that you should have some carbohydrate fairly close to going to bed, and that will help you sleep better.
Yeah, and then you have research pointing a little bit in all directions on that one. So there's also an element of like personal reaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I remember when we spoke before, actually, you were saying that one thing that's not good is to have a one-size-fits-all for everyone. And that's the key part of your job, getting to know the person and the player and what will work for them.
But at the same time, I do like the question, like, are there things that go across a squad, as an example? Would there be interventions where we can say, hey, for everyone, this will have some level of effect? And I think one of the most important things would be education, to be honest, so that people understand the element of sleep and also the components of sleep and where they can help themselves. And when we want to fine tune the basics of that knowledge, that's where we need to look at the individual level as well. Some people can fall asleep and a bomb can go off next to them. They're probably not very sound sensitive. But then you can have people in the squad who are incredibly sound sensitive. So always traveling with earplugs can be a super good idea, as an example. Yeah. And sometimes you have very sensitive players, and then the travel management couldn't book a hotel other than, on the high street where there's a nightclub next to, as an example. Half of them might not respond to it, but half of them might. So having these, like helping hands within reach when it's needed is also a good thing to have. available.
I think another interesting topic is napping. So my understanding is that can be helpful, but you've got to also be careful how you do it because it could impact your night's sleep quite a bit.
Yep, but look, again, because we're scientifically based here also in our conversation, there's a lot of good science about the effect of a nap. But there's also a lot of good science that shows that if we nap too long at the wrong time, we are then compromising the opportunity to sleep really well at night. So the majority of times where the nap is effectful, especially in sports, is if we do a nap below 25 minutes, or if we're sleep deprived and we're trying to catch up on sleep, which we can't, but set ourselves up to night's sleep, which is good, is then completing a full sleep cycle, which is around 90 minutes. And the thing is, very often napping, look, a player would never go in and take a nap with the intention of harming himself. That's key, observation number one, right? They sleep because they feel tired and they want to do something. But the same with food, you eat because you're hungry, right? But if we are then smart in sport, we say, oh, you're hungry because you need calories. And if we're smart around how we give you those calories, we can get your body to function even better. With a nap, it's a little bit the same. If we are napping, let's be smart around how we educate them to nap at the right time and at the right duration so that they get the most out of their nap rather than just whatever taking a nap, which is then hindering them from falling asleep at night. And I would say, going back to your question, common squad education, definitely napping, because a lot of them, they know that a nap can give them something, but they don't have the strategic thinking about when to nap and how to nap.
What?
And more importantly, what to do when you wake up from the nap. And that's the same with sleep. It's not just about how we sleep. It's also, what do I do if I had a crappy night's sleep to set myself up to actually still be able to perform? That's also a sleep strategy, to be honest.
Oh, could you tell us about some of those things? So if you had a crappy night's sleep, how to respond?
You touched upon daylight before. And one of the most important things is that you actually get up and get outside and get some of that daylight exposure. I would also say, it's really important that you hydrate well in the morning. I would also say that this is where caffeine becomes your friend if your caffeine intake is done smart. So I would never recommend caffeine before food, because then you just see an elevation, massive elevation on cortisol, adrenaline. But if you have some food and then you have some caffeine, that can actually really boost your energy in a smart way. And this is where, again, people think I'm a sleep specialist who's against coffee or caffeine for that matter, which I'm absolutely not. Because I believe that induced and used in a smart way, we can make it work in the system where we want to optimize many things at the same time. So a good idea would be, let's say, a club who would have a late kickoff time and they don't have a lot of time to the next match. Allowing the players to sleep in very long is not a very good idea, because that's almost like a fake jet lag. We didn't travel somewhere far away, but we set the body up to jet lag because we let them sleep in a lot longer than normal. If I was strategically involved, I would say it's okay to let them sleep in a little bit longer, but not very much longer. We get them up, we boost energy into them so that we set them up to match day +1 sleep in a smart way. Otherwise, what you will have is negative poor sleep match day, and then potentially also bad sleep match day +1. And that's 2 nights in a row with bad sleep. And having these smart morning interventions, which can be a coffee truck outside the training ground, they don't even see it, but they just have the coffee without knowing it outside in natural daylight. If the club is even smarter, they place the coffee truck 100 meters down the road so that they actually have to walk down and get the coffee. So there are a lot of smart ways to actually induce smart behavior without them even knowing it.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So clubs have actually done that then, have they, on your recommendation?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I wondered if you could just tell us as well about the actual mechanics of a night's sleep. So you were talking about the 90-minute cycles. Probably a lot of people think they go to bed and they just sleep for 6 hours flat out.
There's actually not complete consensus in research about the 90 minutes, but usually we would sleep in a sleep cycle. And during that sleep cycle, what happens is that the body will then descend into different types of phases of sleep. And usually I always get the assumption that deep sleep is the most important part of your sleep, because that's what people have heard, just as they have heard that 8 hours of sleep is, the most important duration that you can hit. Each sleep phase is important for your system because each phase will do something different to your system. And what is also important to understand is that the architecture of your sleep will change with age. And that's why we see children sleeping longer and deeper sleep. And elderly people, they sleep shorter duration and less deep sleep. And the reason why we need more deep sleep as we are growing, and that's quite important still to have in the back of our minds when we have, 15-year-old players who are then presented in Premier League or wherever we see them, because they're still kids, they're still growing. And during deep sleep, that's where you produce growth hormone and testosterone, as an example, right? And when we start to compromise, and that's why you've heard about injury statistics being linked to sleep, when we start to compromise our ability to produce testosterone and also growth hormone, what happens is also that we rebuild the muscle tissue slower. What also happens is when we start to see players sleep with less deep sleep and they produce less testosterone, they age quicker as well. Right? So there's an element of longevity in high quality sleep. And that's why I'm not a fan of just preaching hours, but also quality, meaning that we allow the body to descend into the phases of sleep that will give you the right hormones at the right time as well. And the good question is, so why is that important? And what does that have to do with strategy? So if, as an example, you go to bed with too much stress in your system, you then also produce less melatonin. And then people start to have these weird awakenings at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock, and they don't really know why. And that's because your stress hormone has been blocking your ability to produce sufficient melatonin for you to stay asleep. But as a football player, that can actually mean that you also have less of the deep sleep over time, which means that you age quicker and your muscle tissue then is not repaired in the same way. And that's why these things that can help you descend into the deep sleep faster, by falling asleep faster, by taking the shower, sleeping in a cold room, etc., they actually matter in the longevity of the production of the structure of your sleep.
So you would say have a shower before you go to sleep as well?
Having a shower before you go to bed means that you actually force the body to start to sweat so that the core temperature drops down and you get sleepy. And that makes it easy for you to fall asleep. And when it's easy for you to fall asleep, you start to descend more naturally into the deep sleep phase.
I just wanted to ask you about a couple of the other things I hear about before we move on. Yeah. So one of them is obviously about not looking at devices before bed. And I'm thinking particularly if you look at social media, and it might be a player seeing a fan slagging them off, and now on Twitter, for example, there's lots of videos of people fighting and things like that. Would that raise cortisol then, is it? And then make it harder to sleep?
Look, for years, anyone who opened any social media channel or a podcast like this, we heard that being on the phone before bed is really bad for you. And mainly because the blue light of coming out of the device. Today we know that that's actually not true, that it's more the time spent on your device and what that time spent on your device is doing to your arousal level. There were studies that came out during COVID that actually showed the very opposite, that when people were on their devices prior to going to bed, where they connected with loved ones, they fell asleep easier. And that's a pretty good story to keep in the back of your mind when you're trying to evaluate your behavior on a phone. Look, if you're doing something smart before you go to bed that can actually connect you, calm you down, maybe it's not so bad. But if it's just dumb scrolling for 1.5 hours, it's not even the light, right? It's the time spent on your device and what that time spent on your device can do to your emotional system. Because you're absolutely right. Look, after a match anywhere, there's a high risk of abusement at some level on social media channels, and nor you or I would probably be very good at putting up a guard around that, because it does hit us on an emotional level. And when it does hit us at an emotional level, your body will react with hormones, which is adrenaline, cortisol, and also the sadness, right? No one speaks about sadness, but it is sad when someone attacks you, whether you like it or not. But at the same time, no one really speaks about loneliness in football. It can be quite lonely being, let's say, I don't know, a foreign player that comes to whatever English city. Your whole family is somewhere else. You're quite new to everything. You might have a language barrier, and you keep up appearances during the day, but then you have to go to sleep. And that's where it hits you, right? That it can be, even though you're a megastar somewhere, like it can be quite lonely. And the place where we tend to allow ourselves to feel it, or not even allow, but where we feel it, can often be in the bedroom when we have to go to sleep.
And the other one I was going to ask about is alcohol. Does that wreck your sleep?
The short answer is absolutely yes. Like alcohol and friends, like they're not friends with sleep by no means. And it's kind of weird for people to understand, because most people they will feel sleepy when they've had alcohol, right?
Yeah.
So basically, it's a little bit like you're being put to sleep. But if I then put you into a brain scanner and I would scan how your brain was functioning during that sleep, the sleep that you get from alcohol is very different than when you're not like drinking alcohol. And that's also why if you drink alcohol and you feel like you fell asleep quickly, the good question to ask the next day is not how quickly did you fall asleep or how many hours did you sleep. It's how do you feel this morning? Because my assumption would be you feel like crap. And it's a sedative. It's like when you go to the hospital and you have an operation, they put something into your system so you fall asleep. You're out of this normal world, but it's not natural sleep. And that's where I usually say that alcohol is the most misunderstood sleeping drug on the market, because it doesn't create the type of sleep that you're seeking. It puts you to sleep.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Because you often do feel that you've had a deep sleep if you've drunk alcohol.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, but that's sometimes where the technology can be fun, to be honest. Right?
Yeah.
Because you will definitely see two things. You will see an elevated resting heart rate. And alcohol contains a lot of calories. So that's a little bit back to what we talked about before. You have to burn all that alcohol, which means that your blood pressure is higher and your resting heart rate is higher, which means that you're actually switched on despite the fact that your brain is in a different mode.
Right.
So your body's still working.
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
that was a no-go. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Are there any particular tips on if you are going to have a drink, how long you should leave it? And so say if you had one drink, if you had it by 7 o'clock and...
No, I always try to make myself a bit popular by saying, hey, if you are drinking, day drinking is just so much better.
Okay.
Because then at least you have it like diffused out of your system before you go to bed. But it's a little bit like caffeine as well, right? A lot of people I always meet that one person who has an Italian grandfather who could fall asleep on 4 espressos. And I go like, yeah, okay, that might be an outlier, but most people can actually still fall asleep on caffeine. Like, especially if we've built a pretty high tolerance towards it. But if we then measure the quality of the sleep, it's going to be lower than if you were not drinking caffeine.
Right. Oh, okay.
So being smart around when we cut off caffeine can also be a tactical thing to consider. Yeah,
have you got any tips around that then? Because a lot of people will drink coffee and be interested.
I think my best tip is never to be by no means fanatic, but test it, right? Try to test one thing, like try to cut off caffeine like no later than, let's say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then do not measure only how you sleep, but actually feel your day, like your energy the day after. Because when we start to, let's say, manipulate our quality of sleep in a positive direction, what we have is not just that we sleep better, it's actually that our daytime energy in return is going to be higher.
Yeah.
And that's how it is with sleep interventions. Very often we do not just measure it in sleep, like how many hours or the quality. We should measure it in different variables. And that goes definitely for football as well. Like, do you feel more motivated on the pitch? Do you feel that you can like sustain? Look, as an example, when we sleep, this is also where we store glycogen in our muscles. That's our energy reserve. So when we start to have a higher quality of sleep, we can also push more on the pitch. So the question for someone like me is not just how many hours of sleep did you get? How did you feel when you woke up? It's also, how's the energy on the pitch? How was it for you getting, the body going this morning, et cetera, because a lot of it will be a result of better sleep.
Are you working with any teams at the World Cup at all? Have you consulted with any of them without naming them? Because I know there could be issues about that. But,
yeah, we and well, it's not an issue. It's just being respectful because of the agreements I have with the teams. But yes, I do consult with one of the teams in the World Cup.
And do you think sleep will be particularly important at a tournament like this?
Look, there's a lot of sensational, let's call it. I wouldn't call it news out there, but there's a lot of attention on the structure of the World Cup, and I think it's not sleep alone. It's the conjunction of everything that we are putting them through in the constellation of the World Cup. To be honest, it's not just the sleep; it's also the difference in heights. It's the humidity. It's the temperatures. It's the everything. So if you, as an example, have played in very high temperatures, the hydration really matters, because I said earlier that if you're dehydrated, you produce less melatonin, which means that you will sleep poorly, right? So sleep isolated is not the deal breaker, but sleep as a part of the challenges that we see at the World Cup is definitely an important component. And I think that the teams that work around it in a smart way will have smart opportunities. I think the teams that actually see quick fix solutions, that the teams really need to sleep, and they start to hand out sleeping tablets as an example, as a solution, they will probably have bigger problems, because the sleep tablets will very often bring them to a state of sleep, but there's a big level of aftermath that no one really speaks about. And sleepers were not developed for let's say, congested scheduling. They were developed for sleeping disorders, like a true illness. And I think that the teams that have created also some level of tolerance towards the fact that we know that we need to do interventions here to get them to sleep better here, they will have a more sustainable strategy throughout the World Cup.
There is a bit of an epidemic, isn't there, I think, of sleeping pill use in football. So I think we see this cycle, like we said, maybe importance of sleep leads to anxiety about sleep, leads to a quick fix, and goes round.
I have to say, from a very honest point of view, I'm actually starting to see a positive shift, like a recognition towards the fact that it's not a solution, it's a quick fix. And I've been blessed by working in environments where I've really had some incredible wingmen and women from the medical point of view who were very much in alignment with the structures that I tried to put in place, and thereby not destroying is a wrong word, but they're not by not creating a different pathway out if a player couldn't sleep, as an example. I think I saw it a lot more in the past, where the sleeping tablet became the solution to poor sleep rather than figuring out what the root cause was of poor sleep. And I also think that in the past we saw a lot more prescription of heavy sleeping drugs, benzodiazepines, and they're quite addictive. And this has definitely shifted. But I do want to say one thing. I always feel that I want to protect the medical side a little bit, because when you don't have other solutions in hand, and you are in a situation with a player that really struggles, you kind of need to seek a way out. And it's not illegal for them to prescribe. And I think that the biggest problem about sleepers in high level sports is that we don't have different prescription rules in sports than we have for the normal population. So basically, you can prescribe sleepers to anyone who has suffered from poor sleep 3 days in a week for 3 months, and that's basically any Premier League football player, if I'm honest, right? And that's because of the system, right? When you have 3 matches in a week, which they cutely call like an English week in Germany, but it's very, very normal in the UK. Basically, any player can get sleeping tablets with more or less no question, because the legal side actually allows it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think it's changing because the awareness of the aftermath of the sleepers have become a lot more predominant. But I think it's also incredibly important that it's not just judged that it was done in the past, where there were potentially not as many solutions in hand to mitigating the poor sleep. And that's where the education becomes quite important as well.
And what is potentially bad about the sleepers?
It's quite complex to nail down in one sentence, but the aftermath is basically that you have a lot of like sleep inertia in your system, which can have the same result as actually sleeping quite poorly, which is lowered reaction times, like a blurred brain, depression, etc., etc. And then not the least, the fact that they're addictive. So you need more and more and more to actually get the effect from them. And that's also why we have seen cases in high-level football of addiction that stemmed from sleeping tablets as well.
And you talked about the brain scan. So if you were to do a brain scan on someone who had been on sleepers for a prolonged period of time, you would see different patterns than a good sleep.
It's very difficult to isolate it and say black and white, this is what I would see, but I would definitely over time see that the architecture of how they slept would change. So they would predominantly stay in the upper sleep layers and probably not be able to really go into the deep sleep phase. So like very strongly set, there can also be a correlation between a high intake of sleeping tablet and a higher risk of a muscle injury as well.
And I guess it's not always down to the medical team either, because if a player wants to get sleepers, they're going to be able to through their agent, through themselves.
There are a lot of pathways that needs to be mitigated. And that's also why I say the most important thing is to educate players so that they can make informed choices, right? Ultimately, there will always be a way, and it's not illegal. That's also what's quite important to raise here. So compare it again to nutrition. Look, any football player will have a McDonald's around the corner. But they're educated enough to know that if I go to McDonald's every day, that will not do anything good for my system. And that's where there's a high level of need for education, but there's also a lot of, again, care that needs to go into how we educate them to see this so that they see that the better pathway is something completely different.
What are your ambitions for the future? Because your company's grown a lot, hasn't it, in the last 10 years alone?
I think my ambition for the future is actually to stay very true to where it all started, is to treat sleep as a very important basic. And I think it's very, very important that we don't overcomplicate sleep as well. And I think it's incredibly important that we build systems with this sleep knowledge that we have that fits in to the systems where we are trying to optimize. I'm currently working with a cycling team as well. And I have a cycling team that's completing Tour de France in a couple of weeks, where you have 3 weeks on the road on different hotels every night. If I came in and I preached like normal sleep science, you need to get 8 hours of sleep every day, uninterrupted, etc., I wouldn't change a comma in a setting like that. So I think it's incredibly important that people like me, and there are a lot of good people in the sleep field, that we're very mindful around how we take the knowledge that we have and translate it with respect into the environments that we're in. Because if we do come in and we preach it in the wrong way, what we also do is that we push in a wrong direction, as an example, towards sleepers, because we come in and we say that sleep is very important. So, and that's where I think the education is incredibly important. So when you ask about my ambitions, is that even though, let's say, we grow and we get the opportunity to go into very different environments as well, sleep is a basic, and it needs to be always handled with that like respect and knowledge as well, so that we don't make it more difficult for people to actually get a good night's sleep.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having a lot of good questions.
Thank you for listening to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Teamworks Intelligence. We'll be back next month with another episode.